I don't know where you're listening from, but before we begin, leave me a comment. I've always been curious about the people who follow stories of quiet justice. Maybe you're in Boston, maybe Reno, maybe in some lakeside town I've never passed through. Wherever you are, thank you for being here. My story starts on the morning I stood before the executive board of Hallstrom Care Systems, with every pair of eyes, waiting for a verdict they had already decided. I was the director of clinical AI, the one overseeing the company's entire geriatric complication forecasting system. It was a role I had spent nearly 7 years building, from raw lines of code to Aurora, an architecture running autonomously across dozens of hospitals. I'm not someone who likes talking about myself, but you need to understand this part. This job isn't something you hand to a relative of the right person. It demands near perfect precision, an instinct for reading the smallest signals buried in elderly patient data, and above all, a level of ethics not everyone in that room possessed. There were nearly 20 people on the board that morning, but only one who truly controlled my fate. Margaret Hallstrom, CEO, head of the largest healthcare empire in the West, and my mother-in-law. She walked into every room as if the air itself adjusted to her rhythm, cold, commanding, seasoned. But beneath that shell lived an obsession with control. She couldn't stand anything running well without her hands steering it. Aurora did exactly that. It ran smoothly, accurately, quietly, recognized by independent audits, and increasingly immune to emotional interference, which meant increasingly immune to her. Ethan sat a few seats away, my husband. His expression was impossible to read. Not worried, not sympathetic, more like someone watching a storm from the porch, unsure whether to step inside or pretend he didn't see the clouds rolling in. I used to think his silence around his mother was respect. Later, I learned it was avoidance. Margaret adjusted the file on her desk, slow, deliberate, reminding everyone who controlled the narrative. When she finally spoke, the room went so quiet I could hear the air conditioner. "We have a serious issue in clinical AI," she said. "Significant instability in the predictive model. Unreliable outcomes. Risk in patient classification." I stayed calm. Nothing she said was true, not even close. My model hadn't had a single deviation in 2 quarters. I had documentation, numbers, and independent reviews. But the way she spoke, it wasn't a question, it was a sentence. A man at the end of the table raised his hand, one of the outside consultants Hallstrom had hired recently, the type of person who experiences healthcare through reports and marketing decks. He smiled before speaking. "Based on our evaluation, the core issue is algorithmic stability. The system may simply be over-engineered for its purpose. Sometimes simpler is better. Americans call this mansplaining, explaining something to an expert who built the thing you're explaining." I opened my mouth to respond, but Margaret lifted her hand, signaling I should remember my role, the one being judged. "Thank you," she said to him, then turned to me, her voice flat as a frozen lake. "Lydia, do you have anything to say before we finalize this assessment?" I opened my folder. Yes, these are the last 3 months of numbers. Predictive accuracy is at 96%, with no anomalies, and the independent audit. I didn't finish. A director's phone buzzed. He silenced it instantly, but the screen lit up just long enough for me to see the email preview. A missend and a confession. Remove her before Q4. She is becoming too competent. We must retain control. An email from Margaret was sent last night. I said nothing. The room said nothing. A few eyes flicked toward Margaret, then darted away. The consultant pretended to take notes. Ethan stared at the table. Margaret only tightened her grip on her fountain pen, then continued as if the message never existed. "As I said, the system failure is serious. The board needs a decision now to protect Hallstrom Care System's reputation." One of the external directors hesitated. "Perhaps we should review." But Margaret had already placed her pen on the table. "Lydia Morgan, as CEO, I am terminating your position as Director of Clinical AI, effective immediately. You will be assisted in clearing your desk." No one breathed. Or maybe they did, and I simply couldn't hear it. I felt nothing. No anger, no shame, no fear. Just that cold emptiness you feel walking out of a CT scan, knowing the results might reshape your life. The consultant smiled like he'd just watched a chess match end exactly the way he predicted. A few board members looked away, unwilling to confront the wrongness of what they had witnessed. Ethan squinted, maybe wanting to speak, then shrinking back into silence as always. I gathered my papers, stacked them neatly, and stood. "Thank you for your time," I said. My voice didn't shake. I still don't know why. Maybe because I had lived in this environment too long to be surprised. Maybe because part of me had seen this coming, the cracks widening beneath every empty compliment and every meeting I was suddenly excluded from. No one stopped me. No one apologized. No one asked if I needed anything. At the door, my hand on the cold metal handle, I turned back to look at Margaret. She looked at me like someone who had successfully removed a threat. I gave her a small smile, not forgiving, not yielding, just a promise she didn't understand. I stepped out of the boardroom, and in that moment, I knew one thing. They had fired the first shot. The rest would be mine. When I walked out of the Hallstrom building that morning, I stood under the awning for a moment just to breathe. The late morning silence in Denver had that hollow feeling, the same kind that used to hit me when I stepped out of the ICU after a long night shift. Maybe it was an old reflex. Whenever something collapsed around me, my mind always went back to the years when I first learned what real loss felt like. I had been an ICU physician for more than 10 years. That place matured me faster than every medical lecture combined. I had stood beside elderly patients watching them slip into complications, while the whole team raced against time. One older man once asked me if he would make it. I told him he would be fine, and by the next morning, he was gone after an unexpected blood pressure crash. I knew too well the ache of realizing that if I had seen it earlier, things might have turned out differently. That was what pushed me into medical AI. I wanted to see what we always noticed too late. Around that time, I met Dr. Harris, 72 years old, tall and lean, with eyes that always shone behind thick glasses. He was the one who pulled me back from the edge of burnout. One late night in the staff room, he brought me a cup of tea and told me that if I truly could predict something, I should see it through. He read every algorithm description I wrote, corrected tiny errors, and taught me that medicine sometimes needs more than heart. It needs tools to help us catch the faintest signals before they disappear. It was during that period that I met Ethan. Gentle, kind, always knowing how to ease my stress. But he never understood my work, and he never truly tried to. When I began building Aurora, Ethan thought I was just looking for a new hobby after too many night shifts. I didn't blame him. But even the calmest marriage struggles when only one person believes in the other's future. Margaret, his mother, the CEO of Hallstrom, was nothing like him. She had once watched a young surgeon make a mistake that cost a patient's life on the operating table, and from that moment she stopped trusting anyone outside her family. When I joined the company, she didn't see me as a specialist. She saw me as a troublesome variable. To her, control meant safety. Anything outside her reach was a threat. In my first year at Hallstrom, I focused entirely on refining Aurora. The real-time predictive system grew out of years of my personal research. It could detect early signs of complications in elderly patients, reduce errors, and cut down unnecessary readmissions. When we launched the pilot, Aurora performed better than anyone expected. The board was thrilled. The hospitals were relieved. And Margaret became quieter than usual. I didn't understand the meaning of that silence back then. When Hallstrom proposed buying the entire codebase and ownership rights to Aurora, I refused. I was willing to license it, but I would not surrender the ethics that had shaped the system. We signed a thick license agreement, one that included a suspension clause if the technology was misused. I hid nothing. I only knew that no one in their legal team read as carefully as they should have, and that alone planted a seed no one expected. Over the next 2 years, Aurora became the backbone of Hallstrom's reports. I was praised in meetings, though my name never appeared in official documents. I was used to that. I came here for patience, not for credit. But I noticed Margaret's eyes every time I proposed a new improvement. She was no longer just cautious. She was afraid. A system she did not build and could not control made her feel her power shrinking day by day. Ethan changed more slowly. The evening check-in questions became rare. His answers became vague. When I asked what he thought about a new improvement, he said I should first check what his mother wanted. That wasn't the answer of a partner standing beside me. It was the answer of someone trying to keep the peace through silence. I saw it more clearly when meetings without me became frequent. A project I led was handed to an outside consulting team. They produced shallow evaluations, and I was only informed when everything was already finished. Ethan kept telling me not to worry, that his mother only wanted quality control. But I had long understood that people use the word control to hide the fear of losing power. I remember one night before the day I was fired. I asked Ethan if something was wrong. He looked at me for a long time like he was choosing between what he should say and what he wanted to avoid. In the end, he simply said he was tired after a long day. That was when I realized the distance between us didn't come from work. It came from his choice. And maybe he had made that choice long before I knew I was being judged. Looking back, what happened in that boardroom wasn't a sudden fall. It was the inevitable outcome of years spent looking at each other without truly standing on the same side. And I walked out of Hallstrom not just with a disabled badge, but with the clarity that everything was about to change in a way none of them could predict. After the day I was fired, I carried my laptop, a few folders, and an emptiness in my chest I hadn't felt since my ICU years. But that emptiness didn't last. It shifted quickly into a different kind of clarity, the kind that settles in when you walk into a night shift where a single, irregular heartbeat can signal something much larger. I didn't go home right away. I drove around Denver for a while, then stopped at a small coffee shop near my old hospital. In the smell of roasted beans and the soft clatter of dishes, I opened my laptop and reviewed Aurora's operational reports from the previous week. Everything had looked normal before the board meeting, but subtle anomalies had started appearing in recent weeks. They were hidden deep inside Hallstrom's system. I read each line of the logs, and the truth surfaced clearly. Someone had tampered with the patient priority protocol. They had altered the alert order, delaying certain cases to stabilize cost reports. A cold line ran down my spine, not because of a technical flaw, but because this kind of concealment couldn't happen without direction from someone very high up. That night when I got home, Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, but his eyes kept drifting to his phone as if he were waiting for someone to message him. I asked if he knew anything about the changes in the system. He said his mother mentioned reducing operational costs and that an outside engineering team would handle it. I asked if he understood that delaying treatment for certain elderly patients to save money could be dangerous. He looked at me, confusion pulling at his features. Then he repeated the line I had heard too many times in recent months. "You should ask my mother." I stared at him for a long time. That was when I knew our marriage wasn't just strained. It was peeling apart layer by layer, like paint cracking from the inside long before you ever notice it on the surface. The next day, I went to one of the hospitals in the Hallstrom network to return my personal documents. I saw an elderly woman, maybe in her early 70s, small frame, neatly tied silver hair. She stood against the wall, holding her chest, breathing heavily. I recognized her. Aurora had flagged her as high risk for heart failure. I asked if she had been seen. She said she had waited more than 2 hours. The system placed her in low priority. I walked straight to the intake desk and asked to pull up her file. Aurora had issued the alert, but the priority code had been manually lowered. One glance at the screen told me this wasn't a glitch. It was an intentional override. When I brought her into an exam room, the attending physician confirmed that if she had waited a few more hours, she might not have survived. When I stepped out of the emergency bay, I felt a fury I hadn't carried since leaving the ICU. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted to reshape the system in whatever way benefited their financial reports, even if it cost real lives. The day after, I returned to Hallstrom headquarters to collect the rest of my things. A meeting was happening on the 6th floor about recent technical issues. As I walked by, I heard the so-called consultant presenting with full confidence. He lifted a chart and told the room they needed to simplify the algorithm, mispronouncing it so badly that a few people swallowed their laughter. I stood outside the doorway, listening. Within a minute, I knew they didn't understand the system at all, yet were being paid to speak as if they did. If they pushed ahead with those changes, Aurora would become even more dangerous. As I walked away, I knew my firing wasn't their final move. They wanted to erase my fingerprints from the project, so if anything went wrong, none of them would be held responsible. That night, I started building a contingency plan, one I should have created long ago. I formed a shell company called Beacon Edge LLC. It wasn't just to protect my research, it was a place where I could keep improving the technology with my conscience intact. I set up private servers, backed up the original model, and stored every licensing clause Hallstrom had ignored. I didn't know when I might need them, but 10 years in the ICU taught me that preparation is always better than regret. A few days later, I discovered something that made everything clearer. Ethan had signed a memo without reading it. It was an internal authorization from Margaret, granting the consulting team access to parts of Aurora. Only I had authority. That memo didn't just void my control. It created the grounds for Margaret to accuse me of being uncooperative when they needed to make changes. When I asked Ethan why he signed it, he simply said his mother told him it was administrative paperwork. He trusted her. He always trusted her. And that trust kept him from realizing he had just handed his mother the key to remove me from the very work I built with my own hands. I looked at him, and I knew this was the point of no return. I wasn't as angry as I thought I would be. I just saw clearly that he wasn't on my side, and maybe he never had been. That evening, I closed my laptop and sat in silence for a long time. I knew what was coming, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. I felt absolute clarity. The same kind of clarity I used to rely on from the ICU monitors when making life and death decisions. Their game had begun, and I knew finally I was no longer the one standing in the dark. I went back to Hallstrom on the morning everything finally cracked open, not because I still had a responsibility there, but because I needed to collect the last of my personal things before my badge stopped opening any door at all. I didn't expect that it would also be the day they turned me into the culprit for a disaster they had caused themselves. The fifth floor of the building carried a strange tension. People passed each other with tight eyes but silent mouths, as if sharing a secret no one dared mention. As I approached the executive room, the sound of arguing grew louder. Something serious had happened. I didn't even touch the door before it swung open. A senior manager walked out, face drained of color. He glanced at me for a split second, then dropped his gaze, the way someone does when they feel guilty but have no courage to speak. I stepped inside. Margaret stood in the center of the room, arms crossed, her face so cold no one could guess what she was thinking. On the large screen behind her was Aurora's error dashboard. Almost the entire interface was red. False alerts, delayed response times, priority classifications scrambled. These errors couldn't appear on their own. They had to be triggered by rule-breaking modifications. Margaret didn't wait for me to explain. She turned to the board and said calmly that every major failure originated from the architecture I had designed. She said it the way someone might read the afternoon weather. People nodded automatically, even though I knew they didn't understand anything on that screen. I kept my voice steady. I explained that the failures came from altering the patient priority sequence against the original structure, and that the recent adjustments by the consulting team were the core cause. But Margaret cut me off and said I was trying to shift blame. A few people lowered their heads, not because they agreed with her, but because they didn't dare confront her. Ethan stood behind his mother, slightly to the right. I looked at him, hoping he would say something, anything, even just acknowledge that I had warned him about these risks. But he stood still, hands in his pockets, eyes avoiding mine, as if defending me might anger his mother. That moment hurt more than any meeting could, not because of Margaret, not because of the board, but because of the silence of the person who once promised to stand with me against everything life threw our way. I exhaled slowly. In the ICU, I had learned to stay calm in front of families breaking down beside hospital beds. Calm doesn't come naturally. It comes from knowing that losing control only makes everything worse. I held on to it now for the same reason. Margaret delivered her final conclusion. To protect the company's reputation, Hallstrom had to act immediately. I was terminated for operational risk and refusal to cooperate. They would revoke my access, escort me out of the building, and require that I not return. No one reacted. No one said a single word in my defense. The entire room looked like they had long accepted that Margaret made decisions for everyone. I closed my laptop and held it tight against my chest. Inside it were all the copyright files for Aurora, the licensing terms, and the full development history I had written through countless sleepless nights. I no longer belonged at Hallstrom, but the technology had never belonged to them. As I walked out, a security guard followed a few steps behind me. The receptionist stood up, her face full of discomfort. She handed me the folder I had left the day before, holding it with both hands, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't bring herself to speak. I nodded to her and kept going. Near the entrance hallway, I saw Dr. Harris. He stood leaning against the rail, his eyes carrying a sadness I rarely saw in him. He didn't say anything. He simply placed a hand on my shoulder. A small gesture, but I understood everything he meant. In that moment, I knew I wasn't wrong, and I knew he believed me. People can take your job, take your access, but they cannot take the trust of those who have seen who you really are. As I stepped through the main doors, I saw Ethan waiting outside. He held a piece of paper folded in thirds. When I approached, he handed it to me. He said it was a list of temporary housing options he thought I should consider. I looked at him, then at the paper, then back at the years we had lived together. His face was still gentle, but there was nothing of an ally left in him, only the confusion of someone who didn't know what to do except obey his mother. I unfolded the paper. The list was full of cheap rentals, some near industrial parks, one even labeled suitable for a single person in a transitional life stage. I didn't know if Ethan offered it to help or to wash his hands of responsibility, but at that point, neither mattered. I folded the paper and gave it back to him. I told him I wasn't crying. Crying was a luxury. I only remembered. Ethan tried to say something else, but I had already turned away. Some conversations are unnecessary because they cannot change the truth, and the truth in front of me was clear. I had left a place that had stopped being mine long ago. I walked across the parking lot, my laptop heavier than usual. Not because of its weight, but because of what it held. Lines of code, years of research, licensing terms they never bothered to read. All of it sat in my hands like a reminder that nothing was truly over. Hallstrom could push me out of their building, but they didn't know they had just opened a door for me, a door they would have to face sooner than they imagined. I left the building without looking back, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew if I turned around, I would see the old version of myself standing there, and I wasn't that person anymore. I walked out of the Hallstrom Health Building with an old canvas bag and the same laptop that had followed me since my ICU years. No one else could see it, but I knew that the moment I stepped outside, a line had been drawn. They had chosen to remove me, and they would have to live with that choice. The most interesting part was that I didn't need to sabotage anything. The system would tell its own story. Aurora ran on a structure I had deliberately built under an independent licensing framework. It was not Hallstrom Health's property. They were only renting it in cycles. When I left, I simply allowed the license to expire. Not a single line of code altered. No triggers, no traps. I just didn't renew it. In medicine, they call that avoiding unnecessary intervention. In technology, I call it letting a system return to its rightful owner. 3 days after I was fired, people inside Hallstrom began seeing the first signs. An elderly cardiology patient received a mistimed alert, flagged for evaluation at 3 in the morning, even though her chart clearly marked 8. The recovery unit got a forecast about hypotension risk when the patient was perfectly stable. A clinic check-in desk found swapped data entries, assigning a Parkinson's alert to an osteoporosis patient. The errors were small but constant, scattered but disruptive, like the faint cracking sound of a house waiting to collapse. From what old colleagues told me, the board began asking Margaret questions she couldn't answer. Why the forecast delays were abnormal? Why were false alerts kept appearing? The Federal Hospital Network sent a letter demanding accountability for geriatric risk deviations. Margaret, true to her need for control, refused a single admission. She pushed back. First, she hired an outside engineering team, people confident they could fix everything by accessing the core. They opened the documentation, looked at Aurora's structure, and froze, like they were reading a language they only knew 3 words of. I expected that. Every core module required continuous authentication from Beacon Edge LLC's original server. The server was the only one I could reach. No new license meant no access. When the external engineers failed, Margaret moved to step 2. She ordered a complete rebuild of the alert subsystem. The advisory board called it unrealistic because doing so required at least 6 months and an entire research team with deep AI expertise. The largest investor told her that if she attempted it, they would cut next quarter's budget due to excessive costs. Not willing to concede, Margaret tried another route. She told the internal tech group to reverse engineer Aurora. A former engineer later told me they opened hundreds of logs, ran dozens of simulations, and even compared old Aurora versions. But between guessing and truly understanding an AI's structure lies an entire canyon. They could not trace the predictive logic. Every attempt failed. Meanwhile, the Federal Hospital Network, where Hallstrom provided services, began asking formal questions. They demanded a transparent explanation for the forecasting deviations in elderly patients. When a federal agency steps in, even minor errors inflate into major liabilities. Margaret knew this better than anyone. She knew it could cost Hallstrom a contract worth tens of millions. And nothing terrifies those who live by control more than losing it. Ethan started calling me. At first, his voice sounded hesitant, trying to act normal. Then it turned tense, then panicked. I didn't answer. I had grown used to him only reaching out when something escaped his mother's grasp. I let the phone vibrate on the table while I continued working in the small temporary room Beacon Edge rented, feeling a calm I hadn't known in years. That morning alone, in just 3 hours, my phone showed 64 missed calls. I looked at that number and felt something strange. Not joy, not loud satisfaction, but the quiet understanding you get when you finally see the last line of a long equation whose answer you have known for a while. I hadn't broken anything. I had simply let everything return to the structure they had willfully ignored. Ethan called 5 more times before stopping. I guessed Margaret had finally realized there was no fixing the system without the one person who understood it, and that person, according to the documents they signed, was no longer an employee, Molloy, no longer part of Hallstrom, and no longer obligated to save them from the consequence of their own decisions. In medicine, there is a saying, intervening at the wrong time is more dangerous than not treating at all. In technology, the same rule applies. Margaret chose to intervene. Now they were facing the result. I set my phone face down, opened my laptop, and continued building the next version of Aurora, the one they would never touch again. 6 weeks after I walked away from Hallstrom Health, the first call from a major medical network in Denver appeared in my voicemail. The woman's voice on the other end was low, steady, and without the slightest hint of hesitation. She introduced herself as Wendy Clark, Chief Executive Officer of Summit Care, a geriatric hospital network spread across the western United States. Summit Care wanted me to take on the role of Chief Medical AI Architect, the person who would set the new direction for their entire complication forecasting system. I played the message 3 times before calling back. Not because I doubted the invitation, I just wanted to be sure the sincerity in her voice was as real as it sounded. When I finally called, she said one sentence that made me sit up straight. We do not want your technology. We want you because you know how to hold an ethical line. That is rare and that is valuable. Not long after that, I stood in Summit Care's main conference room, facing a whiteboard, a projector, and a full technical team ready to work. No one looked at me with doubt or hidden judgment the way they did at Hallstrom. Here, people wanted me to succeed because my success meant safety for tens of thousands of elderly patients. Before my first meeting, I received a letter from Dr. Harris. He wrote it by hand, his handwriting still firm, just like the day I first met him in the ICU when he was already past 70. Lydia, I know you carried more than you ever showed, but remember this. When one door closes unjustly, the next one is often the one you build yourself. Do not lower your head. You work to save people, not to satisfy anyone's ego. I am proud you understand the purpose. When things get tangled, return to that. I sat quietly for a few minutes after reading the letter. At Hallstrom, I had been treated like a replaceable employee. But to people like Dr. Harris, I was still a physician. Still, the person who once held the hands of patients struggling to breathe in their final moments. I carried that letter with me on my first day at Summit Care. It reminded me why I truly chose this path. The new job began with long meetings, not the type meant to assign blame or paper over mistakes, but meetings built around creation. Summit Care gave me full authority to design an entirely new AI system. I named it Beacon One, like a guiding light, not replacing physicians but helping them see sooner before things spiraled beyond rescue. I wanted Beacon One to be transparent. No hidden data, no cutting alerts to reduce costs. The algorithm had to explain every prediction. Every modification needed a clear trail. I had watched a system get warped at Hallstrom, where a wrong decision could be hidden with 2 lines of justification. I swore that would never happen again. My colleagues in Denver were young, sharp, and unburdened by the shadows of family power. During one afternoon meeting, a young engineer named Liam looked at me with open curiosity and asked a question. Do you hate your mother-in-law? The room went still for a second, as if waiting for me to break, but I just smiled. I do not hate people. I hate ethical errors. The entire room burst into light laughter, not mocking, but easing us back into focus. Liam flushed red and hid behind his laptop as if he could disappear. I did not blame him. In truth, it was the first time I felt comfortable mentioning Margaret without a weight dropping onto my chest. Beacon One grew faster than I expected. We ran trials in 2 Summit Care hospitals, and the results surprised even me. Early detection of respiratory complications rose by nearly 1/3. The warning window before deterioration shortened significantly. Doctors reported that it felt like having a second pair of eyes staying alert for them at 3 in the morning. I did not know how many times I smiled that week. Not the shielded smile I used at Hallstrom to hide bruises, but a real one, light and honest, the kind that comes when the work finally matters again. While Beacon One moved forward, news reached me that Hallstrom had begun losing more than 1/3 of its patients. It did not make me happy in a petty sense. It simply confirmed the order of things returning to where they belonged. No one can treat patients with a distorted algorithm, and no one can build trust on blind control. A healthcare system rooted in arrogance usually collapses before it even understands its own failure. Ethan sent a few more messages. I read them, then set them aside. There was nothing left to say. He said everything was falling apart and that I was the only one who could help Hallstrom. But I had learned that not every crisis deserves rescue. Some things need to break open before their truth is revealed. One evening, I stood alone in the quiet lab. The warm, yellow lights reflected off screens showing Beacon One's latest simulations. I placed my hand on the cold steel counter, realizing I had crossed into a different phase of my life. I was no longer the person pushed out of a boardroom like a wrongdoer. I was someone rebuilding an entire structure from the ground up, not relying on Hallstrom, not relying on Ethan, not relying on anyone except myself and those who believed in me for the right reasons. Before leaving the lab, I watched the final simulation on the screen. It flagged an early complication in an elderly patient and broke down the reasoning step by step. For a moment, I felt a quiet comfort. If systems like this had existed back then, maybe I could have saved a few more people during those endless ICU nights. I turned off the lights, stepped into the hallway, and felt a peace I had not felt in a very long time. The peace of someone who rose after being struck hard, and not only rose, but walked farther than the old world ever allowed. News of Hallstrom Health being investigated by federal authorities spread almost as fast as reports of Colorado's sudden weather swings. Summit Care had nothing to do with it, but because Beacon One was being tested at 2 major hospitals, I received more questions than usual. A few reporters lingered near the Summit Care building, trying to find anyone who had ever heard the name Hallstrom whispered in a hallway. I stayed silent. My time to speak was still far off. This was no longer my fight. It belonged to the federal investigators now. The investigation began with federal agents gathering 6 months of Hallstrom's forecast history. They reviewed alert discrepancies, treatment delays, and the edited logs Hallstrom had tried to hide. Margaret was required to attend a small hearing held in a plain federal meeting room with dark wood chairs and stark white lights that made evasion impossible. I was not there, but a former Hallstrom physician recounted every detail. Margaret walked into the room with her familiar cold expression, but for the first time she had no advisors behind her, no Ethan, no board members, only herself and a series of questions with no exits. The lead examiner opened with a calm question. Why did Hallstrom continue operating an AI system without maintaining a valid license? And why had the predictive structure been altered in ways that compromised patient safety? Margaret stood straight, taking a few seconds longer than usual before answering. She called it a temporary technical issue, but when they presented evidence showing weeks of interference, she had nowhere to go. After a long silence, she said something that surprised the entire room. We underestimated the role of the original designer. The system relied on principles we did not understand. The physician told me that a few people in the room raised their eyebrows. It was the first time they had ever seen Margaret Hallstrom admit fault, but it was not the kind of admission meant to apologize. It was the admission of someone who finally saw that the battle had been lost long before the hearing began. The session lasted nearly 3 hours. Hallstrom was ordered to stop using the system immediately and provide full disclosure of all risks involving elderly patients. A press release followed shortly after, mild in tone but unmistakably clear. Healthcare facilities should reassess the reliability of systems built on outdated or unverified foundations. That alone pushed dozens of hospitals toward Beacon 1 as the safer alternative. I did not feel triumphant. I simply felt a small piece of justice returning to its proper place. One afternoon after the hearing, Ethan appeared at Summit Care's reception area. I received a message from my assistant saying a man was waiting, claiming he needed to speak with me about family matters. I knew exactly who it was. I still walked out to meet him, not because I wanted to hear him speak, but because I wanted to end something that had dragged on far too long. Ethan stood by the glass door holding a large bouquet. It was a lovely bouquet, if you ignored the price tag he had forgotten to remove from the middle of the stems. I looked at the flowers, then at him. He looked exhausted, his eyes swollen, his hair messy, his shirt wrinkled as if he had just walked away from a long argument. He spoke in a rough, tired voice, saying everything was falling apart, that he did not know what to do if his mother lost her position, that Hallstrom needed me, and that he wanted us to get back together. I let him talk. I did not interrupt or raise my voice. When he finally stopped, I asked him a single question. When I stood alone in that boardroom being blamed in front of everyone, where were you? He went silent. A heavy silence, the kind that makes even the person holding it recognize how sharply it cuts. I continued, my voice steady and clear. I am not going back, not to Hallstrom and not to you. People have to carry the weight of their choices. I carried mine. Now it is your turn. Ethan stared at me a few seconds longer, searching for something in my expression. But there was nothing left for him to find. In the end, he set the bouquet on the small table in the hallway and walked away, forgetting to take the flowers with the price tag still attached. The receptionist glanced at me, trying not to laugh, and I simply shook my head. Some moments become funny at the exact time no one expects them. In the days that followed, elderly patients began choosing hospitals that tested Beacon 1. Some even called directly, asking if they could register for the new system. Physicians reached out to tell me they finally felt relieved. They had a tool that was not driven by cost-cutting targets. Reading those messages, I understood that the painful path I took had led me exactly where I needed to be. No longer the person fired in a cold boardroom, I stood in the middle of a community that trusted the real value of medical technology. And while all of this moved forward, Hallstrom continued sinking deeper into the crisis they had created for themselves. I did not celebrate. I observed the way a physician watches a patient's decline after seeing the signs for far too long. No one can stop a failing system. They can only watch it move toward the end it chose for itself. I received a message from Margaret on a winter afternoon when Denver's cold came in without warning. The message was so short I had to read it twice to make sure I had not misread it. No apology, no explanation. Just a request to meet in a privately rented conference room downtown. People who are used to giving orders never change their tone, even when they are cornered. I arrived on time. When I stepped inside, I saw Margaret seated at the head of the table, no longer carrying the icy confidence that once made an entire Hallstrom boardroom fall silent. She looked smaller, as if the federal investigation had stripped away a weight she had long mistaken for strength. But her eyes were still sharp, still full of will. Someone like Margaret does not fall easily. But her walls had cracked wide enough for anyone to see. She motioned for me to sit. No coffee, no assistant, No thick folders stacked like barricades, just two people, two chairs, and a long stretch of silence. I waited for her to speak first, and she did. My mistake did not begin when I fired you. It began when I believed power could replace competence. The words settled into the room like an old window being pushed shut after a strong wind. It was not what I expected, but it was the only admission she could give without breaking herself entirely. Slow, heavy, difficult. She spoke about the investigation, about the patients Hallstrom had lost, about pressure from the board and the press. But what she struggled with most was admitting that the system she thought she controlled had slipped off course because of her own hand. I listened without interrupting. Some conversations carry more truth in your silence than in anything you can say. Margaret then placed a thin folder on the table. I recognized it instantly. The original Aurora licensing agreement. She said Hallstrom wanted to continue using Aurora to repair their system, but they needed my approval. They had run out of options. Every attempt to rebuild or patch things together had failed. I studied her for a long moment. Not to intimidate her, but to remind myself that this was the same woman who once stood in a packed boardroom and blamed me publicly, who had pulled Ethan into her orbit, who had treated me as a replaceable part. And yet here she was, sitting across from me, looking directly at the consequences of her own decisions. I opened the folder, turned through the pages, and placed my revision on top. Only two conditions: absolute data transparency and mandatory ethical compliance. No altering prediction structures to hide mistakes or manipulate patient alerts. If Hallstrom wanted Aurora, they had to submit to the system's rules, not to the rules of power. Margaret read slowly, like a physician studying a sensitive diagnosis. She did not object. She just asked a single question, so quiet it was unclear what emotion she meant to hide. Are you sure this is the path you want? I nodded. I was not punishing her. I was restoring a balance that should never have been disrupted. Justice in medicine is not a slammed fist or a shouted victory. It is a realignment toward what is right, no matter who it comes from. When Margaret finished signing, the door behind me opened. Ethan stepped in. He was not angry, not defensive, not pretending to be calm. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes on the floor, like a man searching for the right words to an apology he should have made long ago. He apologized. A real apology. No excuses, no blaming his mother, no pretending it was beyond his control. He said he had lost more than he realized, and what he regretted most was not standing beside me when I was attacked from every direction. I looked at him for a long time. Ethan had once been gentle, careful, someone who valued peace. But in that moment, I saw only a man who had let his mother's power chart his course, and who was now standing inside the wreckage of his own passivity. I told him one sentence. Not harsh, not soft, just true. You did not lose me. You dropped yourself. He stayed silent. A silence nothing could fill. I stood, gathered my documents, and left the room. Margaret said nothing more. Ethan did not try to stop me. I walked down the long hallway, stepped outside, and closed the door behind me. No storms, no shouting, no dramatic thrill, just a quiet sense of something finally being put back where it belonged. I stood outside for a moment, breathing in the cold Denver air. I had not defeated anyone. I had simply reclaimed my peace. And sometimes that is the truest and most precise kind of justice. Beacon 1 spread faster than I ever allowed myself to imagine. From the first two pilot hospitals, the system slowly took root across Colorado, then into New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, and the western coastline. Weekly reports arriving at Summit Care showed the same steady pattern. More elderly patients were saved because of earlier warnings. No revenue pressure creeping into the data. No hidden hands skewing the algorithm. Just physicians, patients, and vital signs predicted in time. I still worked in my familiar office at Summit Care, a room with a window facing the Rocky Mountains. Every time I looked up, I saw snow on the peaks, so bright it made you feel like everything could begin again. It was the kind of view Hallstrom never gave me, a space wide enough to see beyond myself. When Beacon 1 was recognized as one of the most transparent forecasting platforms in the region, Dr. Harris and I decided to finally act on an idea we had talked about years earlier: when I was still drowning in ICU shifts. We founded the Aurora Fund, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting medical care for elderly patients who could not afford treatment, especially those facing a high risk of complications. Harris looked a little older, but his eyes were still as bright as the night I first met him in the staff room so many years ago. He smiled and said that creating the fund felt like the final piece of a path I had never dared to name. From a physician to a system designer to someone creating tangible change for the community. I smiled back. He had always seen in me what I only recognized after life forced me to stand up after a hard fall. We held a small opening ceremony at a long term care center. No flashy ribbon cutting, no endless speeches, just elderly faces glowing with hope, and doctors who had spent years sprinting against complications in the middle of the night. Near the end of the ceremony, an elderly man stood up. He looked about 75, hair fully silver, hands trembling a bit, but his voice carried clearly enough to silence the room. If it were not for you, I would not still be here. I looked at him and could not speak for several seconds. His words pulled me back to my ICU years, the people I could not save, the nights I wondered whether I was in the right profession, the moments I thought I was not strong enough to rise after exhaustion. And now all those questions were answered by one sentence so honest, it nearly stopped my breath. People often think empire means power, dominance, and the collapse of someone else. But when I looked at Beacon One's datasets, saw patient stability improve, watched complication rates fall, and heard doctors say they finally had enough time to sit with families instead of rushing into emergencies caused by late predictions, I understood that my empire had never been about power. It had a real impact. No one bowed to me. No one feared me. But they trusted the technology I built, trusted the ethical boundaries I never compromised, and trusted the decisions shaped entirely around patients. That was what Hallstrom never understood. You can lose a title, lose a role, even lose a marriage, but if you never lose your ethical line, you have not lost anything. You have simply cleared a path for something larger. I left the ceremony as the sun slipped behind the mountains. The evening wind carried Denver's familiar cold, but I did not feel chilled. I felt light, calm, whole. Everything that needed closure had closed in that meeting room. Everything that needed to open was opening right in front of me. I stepped into the parking lot, watching the lights reflect on the thin layer of snow, and thought of the entire journey. From the Hallstrom boardroom, where I was blamed in front of dozens, to the long nights coding inside a rented Beacon Edge room, to the federal investigation, to the moment an elderly patient said I had kept him here in this life. Everything connected in a way I could never have imagined on the day I was pushed out of Hallstrom. The empire I built did not stand on its own collapse. It stood on truth. The truth is that patient health matters more than power. The truth is that ethics matters more than reputation. And the truth is that someone can erase your name from a company, but they can never erase the work you did for others. If you are still listening, I want to ask a small question, one that has become a habit in this community we are building. What state are you watching from? And if you like stories of silent revenge told with humanity at the center, subscribe. We have many more to tell.